Here are your finalists for most valuable player.
This is going to be hard.
Luka Doncic of the Dallas Mavericks, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander of the Oklahoma City Thunder, and Nikola Jokic of the Denver Nuggets. Those are your three finalists.
Like, I think it's the whole MVP conversation. It's kind of getting out of control. So I think I'm playing good basketball. The team is playing good basketball. If I win it, great. If I don't win it, congrats to the other guy. I think there is a lot of players playing really good basketball. You know, I think a couple guys deserve to have that award.
Now that the NBA regular season is over, it's going to be interesting to see how the MVP race pans out, especially because there's still really no proper conclusion on who's going to take home the trophy. Now, the odds are heavily in favor of Jokic, and he's been the leading candidate at the top of the standings since Embiid went down back in February, but the debates and conversations about the MVP actually prove that the margin between the top three candidates is not as huge as it looks on paper, and they know it too. In fact, I'm not sure if we've ever seen an MVP race with more than two candidates that are this close in a race. And as you saw in the intro, this is something that Jokic himself knows, and it's also something that SGA touched on at the end of the regular season.
I hope I get it, yes. No, I think all the guys are deserving. All have their case. Whatever happens, happens. But whoever gets it is deserving for sure.
You can be sure that when that time comes and the MVP is announced, there'll be a lot of fans arguing online and talking about how at least one of those two other MVP candidates is more deserving of the trophy than the eventual winner. That speaks of the kind of talent we're seeing at the top of the NBA and the kind of MVP seasons these three have been able to put together. Before we dive into all that, be sure to like this video if you enjoy it and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this kind of content. Let's aim for 300 likes. Now let's get into it. The case for Jokic is kind of unique because with such odds, there shouldn't be a question about whether he's taking it home, but in recent weeks we've been seeing some pushback against the idea of a third MVP trophy for Jokic from different voices within the NBA. Not too long ago, one NBA exec reportedly said that if Jokic wins a third MVP trophy, then it's not going to quote-unquote age well. And a few weeks ago, Gilbert Arenas set the internet on fire when he said this.
Jokic is probably statistically, when it comes to overall game, the worst MVP winner. He's the worst MVP winner in the last 40 years.
And not too long after that, following the Thunder's clinching of the #1 spot in the West, Stephen A. Smith also made it known that his MVP was SGA and specified that it's not Jokic.
SA, tell me this, does SGA have a case for MVP over Jokic?
A case? He's getting my vote for MVP. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander should be the NBA MVP. You don't give me that look, Shannon.
Whether what we're seeing with Jokic is a case of voter fatigue or just straight up hate towards Jokic from Gilbert Arenas and other members of the media, which is something that we've seen in the past, it's clear that Jokic is not the consensus pick for MVP, even though he probably should be the clear favorite to win it. Now, honestly, I do think that Jokic will eventually take home the trophy, but it will most likely be his last one if voter fatigue and attitudes like the ones we saw from Arenas persist. But voter fatigue poses such a huge threat to the integrity of the award because it's like, are voters just gonna penalize players for being too good? Like Jokic, for example, has set a standard for himself and has upheld that standard for the past few years, and he's the reason why the Nuggets are the defending champions and the team to beat. So why is there hesitation when it comes to giving him his third MVP trophy? It could be that MVP trophies put players in a different class when it comes to discussions about where they rank all time, because if Jokic wins a third MVP, then he'll be just one of 9 players to do it. So if Jokic doesn't win it, it's going to be proof that there's clearly an unspoken rule about winning multiple MVP awards that hinders players from winning as many as they could, and Jokic is officially in that territory. But again, getting too fixated on all-time narratives might be a problem because it ultimately affects the integrity of the award system. And this is probably why Embiid called the MVP race toxic when he was asked about it.
I'm happy I'm not in the conversation. That conversation has been toxic for a long time.
On the other hand, this has made the whole MVP race more interesting because if Jokic does suffer from voter fatigue, then it's still not super clear who will win it. There's been a tug of war going on for the spots right below Jokic, and the two guys that have been fighting to claim the next spot are Luka Doncic and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. In the last month of the season, Luka Doncic firmly asserted himself as a top 3 candidate in MVP discussions after a long season of individual dominance. Despite leading the league in scoring and being an offensive machine, March 29th was the first time the Kia MVP ladder board had him in the top 3 since the All-Star break. And before that, Luka was considered to be a top 3 candidate only for the first 4 weeks of tracking the candidates for the award before falling around or below the top 5. This seems to always be the case for Luka, or at least it has been, because in the last few years, he has come into the regular season highly projected to win MVP. In the 2020-21 season, he had the highest odds to win MVP coming into that year, and that was also the case in the 2021-22 season. Last year, he was number 2 on that list, and coming into this season, he was 3rd. So it's clear that the odds makers believed for a while that it would only be a matter of time before Luka took home his first MVP. But now there's actually a sentiment that Luka is suffering from voter fatigue before even winning his first MVP trophy. Despite averaging more points and assists than Jokic and Shai, while not being too far behind in the rebound category, the legitimacy of his MVP case was in question for a while in a way that was very hard to ignore before the Mavs turned it around in the middle of the season.
At this age, do you see MVPs in his future?
Well, I mean,
Definitely one.
to me, it's an interesting question because they're the 8th seed, and if they were in the top 4, he'd be in consideration.
The Mavericks finished the season at the 5th position in the West, but before the hot streak that came after the trade deadline, they hovered between the 6th and 8th spot, which made Luka's MVP case hard to defend, even though his output suggested that he might be the best individual player in the league this season. But to some, that's not enough to win the trophy, especially considering that his counterparts are on the 1st and 2nd seed in the same conference.
Y'all have the same theory. Oh, the team is...
Yeah, it's a team thing.
That has to factor into what is his ability done.
Most valuable player is singular.
No, it's not. No,
Most valuable player is the most valuable player of the league, not of the
That means
team.
he's the baddest mofo in the league.
That's not
Right,
Luka
the
is.
baddest mofo in the league is going to have his team up there.
More than anything, this argument forces us to go back to the age-old debate of what the criteria for winning MVP is. Historically speaking, the MVP has always fit one of the following descriptions. It can be the player who had the most exceptional statistical season, like we saw with Westbrook in 2017 when he set the season record for triple-doubles. Or it can be a player who greatly impacts winning by putting his team among the top teams in the league or in a position that they otherwise wouldn't be. So pretty much a player who makes a team exceed expectations. An example of this is Steve Nash in 2005 when he famously won it at a time when Kobe was considered to be the best player in the league, or Derrick Rose in 2011 who earned MVP honors over Dwight Howard and LeBron because of how he led an injury-riddled Bulls team to the #1 spot in the East. Lastly, the MVP can be the best player on the best team. In an ideal world, the MVP would fit all 3 descriptions, but as we know, that's rarely ever the case. So when Chuck argues that Luka doesn't deserve the MVP award, he's arguing from the standpoint that Luka is not the best player on the best team, and that he hasn't impacted winning in a way that exceeds the expectations that many had for him coming into this season, or that he hasn't impacted winning more than the other candidates. It's hard for people with this argument to see Luka as this season's MVP, but that argument from Chuck is also a little old and outdated because the Mavs turned it around after the trade deadline, going from a 28-23 record to a 21-7 record. But since SGA and Jokic managed to lead their teams to the #1 and 2 seeds in the West, they do have an upper hand on Luka if we're approaching this from a wins perspective. But if you view it from the other criteria like the most exceptional statistical season, Luka's case looks completely different. His averages of 34 points, 10 assists, and 9 rebounds this season combined for the highest total of average points, rebounds, and assists since 1972. Westbrook is the only player who got close to the same total in 2017 with 52.7, and he won MVP that year. And the only person that Luka is trailing with this total is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who also won the MVP in the season he set the record for the highest points, rebounds, and assists total. This season, Luka Doncic also led the league in isolation points, points in the paint, and he's the overall scoring leader in the NBA. So without a doubt, if Luka doesn't win the MVP trophy this season, it's going to be because of where his team is in the standings compared to the other 2 leading candidates. But in this department of an exceptional statistical season, Jokic is currently giving him a run for his money as well because he's the only MVP candidate who is in the top 5 in points, rebounds, and assists. So while I do think that Luka is probably the MVP candidate with the most exceptional season statistically, I could see Jokic getting picked over him in this category when it's time for the media to vote. And now, let's talk about SGA.
I got one more thing to say. He's too humble to say it, but this is the MVP right here. MVP of the league.
SGA. Shai's MVP case is also something that's hard to ignore because this season we have seen him enter a new stratosphere of elite NBA players in a way that's a little bit surprising. When it comes to him, the argument about winning works in his favor better than anybody, and almost every MVP case you'll hear in favor of Shai is predicated on team success.
The #1 seed in the Western Conference.
Percentage
Tell me,
points.
the #1 seed, okay? Oh, by the way, Shannon, not only the number 1 seed, but the number 1 seed with the second youngest team in the NBA. Come on now.
The OKC Thunder finished as the number 1 seed in the West, and throughout the whole season, they were high up among the teams in the West. In fact, OKC held the number 2 spot for the most calendar days in this season, while Denver held the number 3 spot for the most calendar days. And if you're wondering who was at the number 1 spot, that was the Minnesota Timberwolves. But coming into this season, the Thunder were projected to win just 44 games, which would have had them around the 9th spot, but they exceeded those expectations and they managed to win 57 games, which is the most in the last 10 seasons. In just one season, the Thunder went from the 10th seed to the 1st seed in the West, and this looks even crazier when you consider that OKC came into this season as the 2nd youngest team in the league, only behind the Spurs. The kind of season we saw from OKC is far from what teams with that kind of youth and lack of experience should be having, and this is why they're the youngest number 1 seed in NBA history, and it's also the biggest knock on them going into the playoffs. Of course, this is a testament to the team's player development, coaching staff, and depth, but none of it is possible without Shai's individual performance. And that's why many people have him as their MVP. But even from a statistical angle, Shai is having a historic season in his own right because he's only the 3rd player in NBA history to average 30 points or more on 50% shooting while averaging 2 steals. He's had the most 30-point games this season, he leads the league in steals, and is currently top 3 in clutch player of the year voting. We've also seen Shai's stats get compared to all-time great guards in Kobe and Michael Jordan, and I know that many fans are not ready to receive those comparisons, but Shai's season is statistically similar to Kobe's MVP season and even Michael Jordan's MVP seasons as well. And once again, I know that the numbers don't take into account the differences of the eras that each of them played in, so these are not the most accurate comparisons, but there's still something to look at. But if we're to look back to that criteria of leading a team and causing them to exceed expectations, Shai takes the cake for this one, and he clearly fits the description better than any other candidate. But I do think that rewarding a player with the MVP because they exceed expectations is also problematic in its own way, because if that's the case, there will always be a tendency to favor newer candidates or those who haven't won the award. In essence, this is the opposite of voter fatigue, and it's some sort of newcomer bias. Of course, the quote-unquote new candidate has to be deserving of the award to some capacity, but them being young or without a trophy while bringing an element of freshness into the race plays to their advantage. In my opinion, this is part of the reason why Shai's MVP case is so strong. But does that mean that he's not deserving of consideration? No, but it's exactly why some people feel the way they do about him.
I think that shot does it.
Really?
Yeah, the number 1 seed, that shot, listen, we love style. We like cool things, we like buzzer beaters, we like game winners. That did it. You know, Jokic has those games where he fills up stat sheets, but it's like, it's just anticlimactic, you know what I mean? And this right here, and with voters, I think this does it.
Ultimately, the MVP race will always be highly controversial, mainly because of the deep talent pool in the NBA, especially among the top 10 players. While this means that players won't always get their fair share of recognition when it comes to awards, it's still something to look forward to for us as fans because of what it's going to mean for the product of the NBA. That's it for the video. Be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, peace.